the autumn of 1859, the Red Earth plantation lay wrapped in silence so complete, it seemed the air itself had thickened. Cotton fields stretched under overcast skies, their boles stained blood red by the iron-rich soil that cursed this place with its name. What no one realized was that something far more disturbing than bondage was taking root beneath the genteel facade. Neighbors spoke of deathbed confessions from house servants, wild tales of rituals performed under moonless skies, and a hunger spreading through the main house like fever. Records show unexplained disappearances, frantic orders for impossible quantities of food, and correspondence that grew erratic as winter approached. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. If this is your first time here, subscribe so you don't miss the truths history tried to bury, because what happened at Red Earth goes beyond anything conventional history dares to record. By December, investigators would find a dining room set for four, with fine china holding remnants of a meal no Christian soul should contemplate. They would close the case with barely a whisper, filing it as too disturbing to document. This was not just murder. This was a hunger that consumed everything it touched. Picture this scene from the coroner's unsigned notes, filed away in 1860 with the simple notation that some discoveries are better left unrecorded. The dining room of the Croft family home, once the pride of Blackwater County, now resembled something from a fever dream. Mahogany tables set with the finest china, sterling silver gleaming in the flickering candlelight, crystal glasses still half filled with wine that had turned to vinegar. But the feast itself defied comprehension. On bone-white porcelain plates lay strips of meat, carved with the precision of someone who knew their way around a butcher's block. Yet the texture was wrong, the color too pale, too familiar. The sound that echoed through those walls was not the civilized conversation of a proper Southern family, but something primal, desperate, animalistic. The wet tearing of flesh, the grinding of teeth on bone, the satisfied groans of appetites finally being sated. Silas Croft sat at the head of the table, his once pristine white shirt now stained crimson, his face smeared with grease and something darker. His children, Elijah and Abigail, flanked him on either side, their eyes vacant and glassy, their mouths working mechanically as they consumed their portions with single-minded focus. The empty chair where Prudence Croft should have sat told its own horrific story. In the doorway, barely visible in the dancing shadows, stood a figure watching this grotesque tableau with eyes that held no surprise, no horror, only a grim satisfaction. Obadiah had seen the hunger in their hearts long before it manifested on their plates, had known that their appetite for human suffering would eventually turn literal. The curse he had woven into the very soil of this plantation was finally bearing its rotten fruit. The family that had built their fortune on consuming the lives and labor of others was now literally devouring itself, and the man whose family they had murdered watched them fulfill their true nature. They were finally eating the cost of their own fortune, and the taste was everything he had promised it would be. How did a respected plantation family, pillars of their community, become the main course at their own dinner table? To understand what happened at Red Earth, you must first understand the land itself, for this was no ordinary plantation. Imagine, if you will, a hand-drawn map of Blackwater County from 1859. The kind surveyors create with meticulous attention to every creek, every road, every property line. Now look for Red Earth Plantation, and you will notice something unsettling about its placement. It sits like an island of human ambition in a sea of wilderness, surrounded on three sides by the Blackwater Pine Barrens, a maze of cypress swamps and boggy lowlands that stretch for miles in every direction. The nearest neighbor lives 7 miles to the east, the closest town a full day's ride, through roads that turned to mud at the first hint of rain. This isolation was not accidental, it was necessary. What the Croft family was building required privacy, secrecy, and the kind of distance that keeps curious eyes from seeing too much. The plantation house itself stood like a white dollhouse dropped into this wilderness, its Greek revival columns and manicured gardens, a desperate attempt to impose civilization on a landscape that seemed to resist human habitation. But it was the soil that made red earth truly distinctive, that iron-rich clay that stained everything it touched the color of dried blood. Local folklore claimed the ground had always been that color, even before the first cotton was planted, as if the earth itself had been soaked in violence long before the Crofts arrived. The enslaved quarters were built at the very edge of the cleared land, where the cultivated fields met the dark wall of the pine barrens. From their cabin doors, the workers could see the twisted cypress trees rising from black water, could hear the night sounds of creatures that belonged to an older, more primal world. It was as if the plantation existed on the boundary between civilization and wilderness, order and chaos, the human and the inhuman. The river that gave Blackwater County its name wound through the property like a vein of dark blood, its tannin-stained waters reflecting nothing, revealing nothing. Travelers who crossed that river spoke of an oppressive feeling, as if the very air grew heavier the moment they set foot on red earth soil. The land seemed to watch them, to weigh them, to judge whether they were worthy of leaving. This was not just a farm, this was an ecosystem of control, a closed system where every element served the appetites of the family at its center. The cotton fed their greed, the enslaved fed their pride, and the isolation fed their sense of absolute power. But ecosystems can be poisoned, and when they are, the contamination spreads to everything within their boundaries. What seemed like the perfect foundation for a plantation dynasty was about to become a trap, a prison of their own making, and the very isolation that had protected their secrets would soon prevent any escape from what they had awakened. This wasn't just a farm, it was an ecosystem of control about to be poisoned at its root. The bill of sale from 1858 describes Obadiah simply as a stout field hand with no particular skills, purchased for $800 from a Virginia tobacco farmer. But the man who studied that document, who watched the ink dry on his own enslavement, possessed knowledge that no white man could price or comprehend. His hands might have been bought to work cotton, but they carried memories of his grandfather's farm in Yoruba land, of rituals that connected the living to the land and the land to the ancestors who slept beneath it. Silas Croft, the patriarch who signed that bill of sale, was a man whose appetites had grown fat on 43 years of getting everything he wanted. His greed was not the desperate grasping of a poor man made good, but the casual entitlement of someone who had never known want. He consumed land, labor, and lives with the same thoughtless efficiency he applied to his breakfast, always reaching for more before he had finished what was already on his plate. The Red Earth Plantation was his greatest feast, a banquet of human suffering served on fine china. His wife Prudence embodied a different kind of hunger, the gnawing need to be admired, envied, recognized as the finest lady in Blackwater County. Her vanity was not mere pride, but a consuming obsession with maintaining the facade of gentility even as the foundation it rested on grew more rotten with each passing year. She would spend hours arranging flowers while the screams of the whipped drifted through her parlor windows, humming hymns to drown out the sounds of her husband's cruelty. Their eldest son Elijah had inherited his father's brutality, but none of his self-control. A young man of 18 whose rage burned so hot it sometimes escaped his grasp entirely. He took pleasure in the breaking of spirits, in the moment when defiance crumbled into submission, and he had learned that the threat of violence was often more effective than violence itself. He was his father's eager apprentice in the art of human consumption. daughter Abigail, 16 years old and beautiful in the way that money and leisure can make a woman beautiful, cared for nothing beyond her own comfort and amusement. The suffering that funded her silk dresses and French perfumes was as distant to her as the weather in China, an abstract concept that had no bearing on her immediate concerns. Her apathy was perhaps the most chilling of the family's sins, a willful blindness that allowed atrocity to flourish in her peripheral vision. But it was in the contrast between the main house and the quarters that the true nature of the Croft family system revealed itself. While fine silver gleamed on mahogany tables, the enslaved ate from wooden bowls with their hands. While crystal decanters held aged whiskey, workers drank from a shared dipper at a well. While feather beds supported the dreams of their masters, families huddled together on straw pallets, counting the hours until another day of labor began. Obadiah moved through this world of extremes with quiet observation, his hands learning the rhythm of cotton picking, while his mind catalogued every cruelty, every excess, every moment when the family's true nature showed through their civilized veneer. He saw how they fed on the labor of others, how they grew fat on suffering, how their hunger for control and comfort had made them into something less than human. The system was perfectly balanced, a machine designed to convert human lives into luxury and suffering into profit. Every component had its place, every person their role, every day its quota of pain and production. It was a masterpiece of organized oppression, refined over generations into an efficient engine of consumption. But machines can break when the wrong pressure is applied to the right place, and the system that seemed so perfectly balanced was about to encounter a force it had never been designed to withstand. The system was perfectly balanced, until one man's cruelty shattered it forever. Prudence Croft's letter to her sister, dated October 15, 1859, mentions what she calls a disagreeable incident with two runaways that Silas handled. The casual dismissal in those words, the way she relegates murder to the level of a household inconvenience, reveals everything about how completely the family had divorced themselves from the humanity of those they enslaved. But behind that euphemistic language lay a horror that would crack the foundation of the plantation system and unleash something far darker than any overseer's whip. Obadiah's wife Kessie and their son Samuel had planned their escape for months, gathering information from other enslaved people about safe routes through the Pine Barrens, about which stars to follow and which sounds meant danger. They had no illusions about the risks, but the alternative, watching their son grow into the same broken servitude that had consumed their own lives, was a fate worse than death. They left on a moonless night in early October, slipping away from the quarters while the rest of the community slept, carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs and a desperate hope for freedom. For 12 hours, they moved through the twisted landscape of cypress and black water, following animal paths and creek beds, believing that the wilderness that terrified their masters might become their salvation. But Silas Croft had invested too much money in human property to let it simply walk away into the darkness, and his son Elijah had been raised to see escape attempts not as desperate bids for freedom, but as personal insults that demanded violent response. They organized the hunt at dawn, releasing the hounds and following their howling chorus deeper into the barrens than any white man had ventured in years. The dogs found them at the edge of a stagnant pond, huddled together in the exposed roots of a massive cypress tree. What happened next was not the capture that plantation law prescribed, nor even the brutal beating that custom demanded. What Silas and Elijah Croft did in those dark waters, witnessed only by the indifferent trees and the circling buzzards, crossed a line that separated cruelty from evil. They could have brought them back alive. They could have made them examples. They could have sold them south as punishment. Instead, They chose to demonstrate that their power over black lives was absolute, that even the dream of freedom was a crime punishable by death. When Obadiah found the bodies hours later, left as a warning at the edge of the cleared fields, he saw what masters could do when they stopped pretending to be civilized. His wife's hands were still reaching toward their son. Their blood had already begun to mix with the red earth that would soon become their grave. The other enslaved workers had learned long ago to make their faces blank in the presence of such atrocity, to swallow their rage and bury their grief so deep that even they could not find it. But Obadiah did not cry. He did not scream. He did not beg the heavens for justice or curse the cruelty of mortal men. He simply stood in that blood-soaked clearing and felt something fundamental change inside him, like a key turning in a lock that had never been opened before. The grief was there, vast and overwhelming, but beneath it was something else, something patient and calculating and utterly without mercy. Grief is one thing, but Obadiah's silence after the discovery was of a different, more dangerous nature. For 3 days after the murders, Obadiah worked in the fields with the mechanical precision of a man whose soul had traveled somewhere his body could not follow. The other enslaved workers watched him with growing unease, recognizing something in his stillness that spoke of decisions being made in places deeper than conscious thought. Old Jeremiah, the groundskeeper whose testimony would later be recorded by a Freedmen's Bureau agent, spoke of those days as the time when Obadiah was calling on a power older than the master. On the third night, when the moon had waned to nothing and the plantation lay wrapped in absolute darkness, Obadiah began to gather what he would need for the working that his grandmother had taught him before she died, before he was sold away from the only land that had ever known his name. The ritual required intimate tokens, pieces of the murdered that could carry their essence into the working, and so he returned to the place where his family had fallen. From the blood-soaked earth he collected soil that had drunk their last breath. From Casey's body still laid out in the quarters awaiting burial, he cut a lock of hair that had never known a master's touch. From Samuel's small hands, he took a pebble the boy had been clutching, some treasured stone that had given him comfort in his final moments. These things were not mere objects but vessels, containers for love and loss and the unbreakable bonds that death could not sever. He worked by touch alone in the suffocating darkness of the pine barrens, his fingers remembering skills his grandmother had pressed into them decades before. The totem took shape slowly under his hands, hair and earth and stone woven together with fibers, from plants that grew only in the deep swamps, bound with his own blood and sanctified with words in a language that had never been written down, words that connected the living to the land and the land to the vast network of power that flowed beneath the surface of all things. But this was not a prayer for peace or a plea for his family's souls to find rest in the afterlife. This was a curse, specific and surgical, and designed to reflect the sins of the Croft family back upon themselves with interest compounded over generations of suffering. He asked the land to show them what they truly were, to strip away the veneer of civilization and reveal the consuming hunger that had always lurked beneath their genteel manners. If you want to understand what happens when the powerful experience true desperation, then make sure you're following along, because what Obadiah unleashed would shake the foundations of the plantation system itself. As he buried the cursed totem in the red earth of the South Field, the most fertile ground on the plantation where the cotton grew tall and white and profitable, he spoke words that had been passed down through 7 generations of his family, words that bound the living to the dead, and the dead to the justice that mortal law would never provide. He was not asking for his family to be avenged. He was asking for the Crofts to be revealed, for their metaphorical consumption of human lives to become literal, for their hunger to turn inward until they devoured themselves from within. The land accepted his offering with the silence of something that had been waiting for exactly this moment, this perfect alignment of grief and knowledge and righteous fury. The earth seemed to sigh beneath his hands as he covered the totem, and for the first time since he had found his family's bodies, Obadiah smiled. He didn't ask for a quick death. He asked for the land to reflect the hunger of their hearts back at them. The plantation ledger from Red Earth tells the story of the curse's manifestation in the dry language of commerce and agriculture. But between the lines of cotton bale counts and livestock inventories lies a record of supernatural horror unfolding with methodical precision. The first entry that hints at what was coming appears just 4 days after Obadiah buried his cursed totem. A brief note that the South Field cotton had developed an unusual discoloration despite the recent harvest. Within a week, that discoloration had spread through the entire crop like a plague, turning the white bolls first yellow, then brown, then black as if they had been dipped in tar. The smell that rose from those rotting plants was nauseating. Not the clean decay of natural death, but something putrid and wrong, like meat left too long in the sun. Workers assigned to clear the blighted cotton reported feeling violently ill after only minutes in the field, and several refused to return despite the threat of punishment. But the curse's appetite was not satisfied with destroying the source of the family's wealth. The livestock began to sicken next, not from any disease the veterinarians could identify, but from what appeared to be simple starvation, as if the animals had forgotten how to eat. Prize breeding stock that had been fat and healthy grew gaunt and hollow-eyed seemingly overnight, standing motionless in pastures full of fresh grass, their ribs showing through hides that hung loose as burial shrouds. The family's prized Yorkshire hog, a massive boar that had been the envy of the county, was found dead in its pen one morning, reduced to little more than skin and bones despite having access to unlimited feed. The overseer who discovered the carcass later told investigators that it looked as if something had consumed the animal from within, leaving only the empty shell of what had once been a 1,000-pound beast. What no one realized was that the land itself had become hungry, and everything that drew sustenance from Red Earth soil was slowly being drained of life. The wells began to run low despite the autumn rains, as if the water table itself was being consumed by some subterranean thirst. Trees that had stood for decades began to drop their leaves out of season, their branches reaching skyward like desperate arms begging for nourishment that would never come. But it was inside the main house that the curse revealed its true target, the family's legendary appetites, already excessive by any reasonable standard, began to intensify into something desperate and uncontrollable. Silas Croft, who had always eaten with the enthusiasm of a man who enjoyed the pleasures of the table, found himself consuming meals that would have fed 3 men, yet rising from the table still unsatisfied, still hollow, still reaching for more. Prudence, whose delicate constitution had always limited her to small portions and careful dietary restrictions, began eating with a voracity that scandalized the house servants. She would demolish entire roasts at a single sitting, then demand that the kitchen prepare more, her usual concern for maintaining her figure abandoned in favor of satisfying a hunger that seemed to grow larger with every bite she took. The plantation ledger entries from this period make for disturbing reading, showing orders for food that defied all logic and reason, where a typical month might see requests for 20 pounds of beef and 10 pounds of pork. November of 1859 shows orders for 5 times that amount, with additional requests for exotic delicacies that had never before appeared on the Red Earth dining table. Yet no matter how much food arrived at the plantation, it was never enough. The family consumed everything with desperate efficiency, like wild animals preparing for a winter that might never end. The kitchen staff worked around the clock to keep pace with their demands, but even tripling their efforts left the Crofts complaining of empty stomachs and unsatisfied cravings. The curse was working exactly as Obadiah had intended, turning their metaphorical consumption of human lives into a literal hunger that could never be filled. Their normal gluttony was intensifying into something preternatural and uncontrollable, and soon the usual supplies would not be enough to sate it. Their hunger was no longer metaphorical, and soon the usual supplies would not be enough to sate it. The sheriff's ledger for Blackwater County contains a single entry from December of 1860 that would prove to be far more significant than the lawman who wrote it could have imagined. Filed under missing persons, it records the disappearance of one Reverend Matthias Holcomb, a traveling preacher from the Methodist circuit who had been making his rounds through the remote plantations of the county when he simply vanished without a trace. Reverend Holcomb arrived at Red Earth Plantation on the evening of November 20th, 1859, seeking shelter for the night as was customary for circuit preachers in that isolated part of the county. He was a man of simple faith and boundless optimism, the kind of minister who believed that the light of Christ could illuminate even the darkest corners of human nature. He carried with him a worn leather Bible, a change of clothes, and an unshakable conviction that all souls could be saved with the proper application of Scripture and prayer. What he found at Red Earth unsettled him from the moment he crossed the threshold of the main house. The Croft family gathered around their dinner table like wolves around a kill, their faces smeared with grease, their eyes bright with a hunger that seemed to go far deeper than any normal appetite. The sounds they made while eating were not the polite conversation of civilized people, but something primal and disturbing, wet tearing noises punctuated by satisfied groans that belonged more in a slaughterhouse than a dining room. Silas Croft welcomed the preacher with the exaggerated courtesy of a man who was trying very hard to appear normal, but there was something manic in his hospitality, a desperate edge to his smile that made the reverend's skin crawl. Prudence barely looked up from her plate, where she was methodically dismantling what appeared to be an entire ham with her bare hands, her usual attention to etiquette abandoned in favor of more efficient consumption. The children were worse. Elijah stared at the preacher with undisguised hunger, his gaze lingering on the man's soft flesh with the calculating assessment of a butcher sizing up livestock. Abigail giggled incessantly between bites, a high-pitched sound that seemed to echo from the walls long after it should have faded, her lips stained red with whatever she had been consuming. But it was the enslaved workers who truly frightened Reverend Holcomb. They moved through the house like ghosts, their eyes carefully averted, their faces blank with the kind of terror that comes from witnessing things that should not exist in a Christian world. When he tried to speak to them about their spiritual welfare, they turned away with expressions of such profound warning that he felt his words die in his throat. Only one man would meet his eyes. Obadiah, working in the evening shadows near the quarters, looked directly at the preacher with an intensity that seemed to burn right through him. There was no hatred in that gaze, no anger, only a calm certainty that made the reverend's blood run cold. When their eyes met, Obadiah spoke just 4 words, so quietly that the preacher almost missed them. "Leave before they eat." The reverend tried to dismiss the warning as the superstition of an uneducated slave, but something in Obadiah's tone suggested knowledge of terrible things to come. That night, lying in the guest bedroom with its fine linens and crystal water pitcher, Reverend Holcomb listened to sounds from the dining room below that kept him awake until dawn. The scraping of chairs, the clink of silverware, the wet sounds of consumption that seemed to go on for hours without pause. When morning came, he announced his intention to continue his circuit immediately, claiming urgent business at the next plantation. The family's disappointment was palpable, their protests a little too insistent, their smiles a little too hungry. But Silas Croft was still enough of a gentleman to provide the preacher with directions through the Pine Barrens, even offering to send Elijah along as a guide to ensure safe passage through the treacherous swampland. The Reverend politely declined the escort, mounted his horse, and rode away from Red Earth as fast as dignity would allow, not looking back even once at the White House that sat like a cancer in the middle of that blood-red landscape. He was supposed to bring salvation, but he was about to become a sacrifice to a different God. What happened next can only be pieced together from fragments of testimony and the terrible logic of the curse itself. Reverend Holcomb's horse returned to Red Earth Plantation 3 days later, riderless and wild-eyed, its flanks streaked with foam and what appeared to be dried blood. The animal collapsed at the edge of the cotton fields and had to be destroyed, but not before several witnesses noted that it seemed to be trying to run away from something in the direction of the Pine Barrens. Silas Croft organized the search party with the kind of efficiency that suggested he had been preparing for this moment. He gathered his son Elijah, 2 of the more trusted house servants, and an assortment of lanterns and rope, claiming that it was their Christian duty to find the missing preacher before he perished in the trackless wilderness. But Jeremiah's later testimony suggests that this was not a rescue mission, but something far more sinister. A hunt organized by predators who had already caught the scent of their prey. They found Reverend Holcomb in the deep barrens, perhaps 2 miles from the plantation proper, sitting at the base of a massive cypress tree with his Bible open in his lap and his eyes staring sightlessly at something in the canopy above. He was alive, but clearly not himself, muttering fragments of scripture mixed with words that made no sense. His usually neat appearance disheveled and his clean clothes stained with mud and worse things. The preacher had been lost in those woods for 3 days and nights without food or water, wandering in circles through terrain that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at it. The curse that Obadiah had woven into the very soil of Red Earth had reached out beyond the plantation boundaries, creating a maze of false paths and deceptive landmarks that trapped unwary travelers in an endless loop of confusion and despair. By the time the search party found him, Reverend Holcomb was more hallucination than man, his mind broken by exposure and whatever he had witnessed during his ordeal in the haunted swampland. He spoke of trees that moved when he closed his eyes, of voices calling to him from beneath the black water, of shapes that followed him just beyond the reach of peripheral vision. But it was his physical condition that truly disturbed the men who found him. Despite 3 days without food, the preacher appeared well-fed, even plump, as if he had been dining on rich meals throughout his time in the wilderness. His skin had a waxy, translucent quality that suggested some fundamental change in his very substance, and when Silas Croft touched the man's arm to help him stand, he later told his family that the flesh felt strangely soft, almost tender. The search party carried the mad preacher back to the plantation house, where Prudence attempted to care for him with the kind of attention usually reserved for a prized Christmas goose. She bathed him with her own hands, dressed him in Silas's finest clothes, and insisted that he rest in the main guest bedroom, while she prepared what she called a restorative meal to help him recover his strength. But Reverend Holcomb never recovered his sanity, and his presence in the house seemed to intensify the family's unnatural hunger to an unbearable degree. They gathered around his sickbed like mourners at a wake, but their eyes held no compassion, only a desperate yearning that grew stronger with each passing hour. The sound of their breathing filled the room, heavy and wet and somehow predatory. On his second night back at the plantation, the preacher's fevered ravings finally ceased, and an unnatural silence settled over the house like a burial shroud. When dawn came, the guest bedroom was empty, and there was no sign that Reverend Holcomb had ever been there at all, save for a few stains on the fine linens that the house servants whispered looked remarkably like gravy. Jeremiah's testimony about those days speaks of the stranger who came and never left, but also hints at something far more disturbing. He claims that the family's evening meals became longer and more elaborate after the preacher's disappearance, that the kitchen staff was dismissed early each night, and that the sounds of dining that drifted from the main house had taken on a new quality of satisfaction and contentment. The line had been crossed, and the taste of what they had done would only make them hungrier. The final pages of the Red Earth Plantation ledger tell a story of complete collapse written in increasingly frantic handwriting that deteriorates from Silas Croft's usually meticulous script into something barely recognizable as human writing. The entries from late November of 1859 show a family attempting to maintain the illusion of normalcy even as paranoia consumed them from within like a cancer. Food orders that had been merely excessive became completely irrational. Single-day requisitions called for entire sides of beef, whole pigs, barrels of flour, and sugar that would normally last a household months. But even more disturbing were the special requests that began to appear, items that had never before been ordered by any respectable Southern family. Requests for exotic spices used in preserving meat, for specialized cutting implements, for salt in quantities that suggested something far more sinister than simple preservation. Abigail Croft's diary from this period provides a window into the family's deteriorating mental state, though her entries become increasingly difficult to decipher as December approaches. Her initial complaints about ruined dresses and canceled social engagements give way to rambling observations about taste and texture, about the way different preparations affected flavor, about techniques for tenderizing that she claimed to have learned from watching the kitchen staff. By the first week of December, her handwriting had devolved into barely legible scrawls that spoke of hearing sounds in the walls, of voices calling to her from beneath the floorboards, of dreams where she was both the hunter and the hunted. Her final coherent entry, dated December 10th, contains only the phrase, "Mother tastes like butter and tears," repeated 17 times in increasingly erratic script. But it was the physical transformation of the house itself that most clearly documented the family's descent into something inhuman. The Crofts had always maintained strict household routines, with servants cleaning and maintaining every surface to pristine condition. Now, according to testimony from the few workers who remained, basic maintenance ceased entirely as the family retreated deeper into their obsessions. Windows were boarded up from the inside, not for protection, but to prevent anyone from seeing what was happening within those walls. The dining room, once the pride of the plantation, was closed off entirely, with the family taking their meals in smaller, more private rooms where they could indulge their appetites without the scrutiny of household staff. The kitchen became a place of secrets, with the family dismissing the cooks and preparing their own meals behind locked doors. Strange smells drifted through the house at all hours, not the familiar aromas of Southern cooking, but something altogether more disturbing, the scent of meat cooking in ways that defied conventional preparation. Paranoia gripped the remaining members of the household as they began to view each other not as family, but as potential threats to their private feasts. Doors that had never been locked were suddenly secured with multiple bolts. Conversations were conducted in whispers, and family members were observed watching each other with the calculating gaze of predators sizing up potential prey. The enslaved community, already terrified by the changes they had witnessed, began to abandon the plantation despite the certainty of punishment if they were caught. One by one, families slipped away into the pine barrens, preferring to face the dangers of the wilderness than to remain in a place that had become something worse than hell. Old Jeremiah, in his testimony to the Freedmen's Bureau, described those final weeks as a time when the very air in the house became thick with the smell of fear and hunger. He spoke of hearing the family members prowling the halls at night, of doors opening and closing at strange hours, of hushed conversations that sounded more like the planning of hunts than normal family discussions. The breaking point came when Silas Croft made a decision that would seal the family's fate. Faced with dwindling household staff and growing suspicion from the few neighbors who still maintained contact with Red Earth, he announced that the plantation would be sealed entirely, with no one permitted to enter or leave without his explicit permission. This isolation was presented as a temporary measure to protect the family from the growing unrest in the county, but the remaining servants understood it for what it truly was, a trap designed to ensure a steady supply of prey, locked in together with no outside oversight and no possibility of escape. The inhabitants of Red Earth Plantation would be forced to confront the logical conclusion of their unnatural hunger. Locked in together with no outside food, their hunger would soon turn its gaze inward. The coroner's unsigned note, discovered years later in the dusty files of Blackwater County, describes what he found in the main house at Red Earth Plantation as beyond the capacity of civilized language to properly convey. But the note also hints at something even more disturbing than the scene itself: the suggestion that what happened in that house during the final week of December 1859 followed a terrible logic, as if each horror was a carefully planned step toward an inevitable conclusion. By mid-December, the sealed plantation had become a prison where the inmates were both guards and prisoners, predators and prey, locked in a deadly game where the rules were written by hunger and madness. Silas Croft, the patriarch who had orchestrated this final isolation, found himself in the position of a general who had painted himself into a strategic corner from which there was no honorable retreat. The remaining household consisted of only the immediate family and 3 enslaved workers who had been too frightened or too loyal to attempt escape. The food supplies that had once seemed adequate for a long siege were disappearing at an alarming rate, consumed not just by the family's unnatural appetites, but by their complete inability to feel satisfied regardless of how much they ate. Silas, whose rationality had always been the backbone of the plantation's operation, made calculations with the cold precision that had once made him wealthy. 5 people eating at the rate they had been consuming food would exhaust their remaining stores within days, not weeks. The logical conclusion was unavoidable. Someone would have to make a sacrifice to ensure the survival of the others. The decision of who would bear this burden was made with the same methodical consideration Silas had always applied to his business affairs. Prudence, his wife of 23 years, had become the weakest member of the household, her strength sapped by weeks of frantic eating that had left her soft and sluggish. More importantly, she had been exhibiting signs of what he diagnosed as hysteria, sobbing uncontrollably at meals and speaking to deceased relatives who appeared to her in the shadows of the dining room. The choice was made on the evening of December 18th, during what would prove to be the family's last gathering in the formal parlor. Silas announced his decision with the same matter-of-fact tone he had once used to discuss the sale of cotton or the punishment of wayward slaves. Prudence's condition had become a threat to the entire household, he explained, and difficult circumstances required difficult choices. What happened next can only be reconstructed from the physical evidence discovered months later and the brief, cryptic notes Silas made in his personal journal during those final days. The struggle was brief and largely one-sided, Prudence's weakened condition making resistance impossible. The family worked together with the efficiency of a practiced slaughtering crew, each member contributing to the task with a mechanical precision that suggested this was not their first such endeavor. The aftermath was handled with the same methodical approach that had characterized all of Silas's business dealings. The finest china was retrieved from storage, the silver polished to perfection, the dining room prepared as if for a state dinner. The meal was served with all the ceremony the family had once reserved for Christmas or other special occasions. But what should have been a solution to their immediate crisis only intensified the fundamental problem. The taste of what they had consumed awakened something in them that was far more powerful than simple hunger, a craving that went beyond physical sustenance into realms of sensation and experience that no normal food could satisfy. Elijah, who had inherited his father's capacity for brutal efficiency, suggested that their current approach was inefficient and wasteful. Why wait for starvation to force their hand when they could take a more proactive approach to resource management? Abigail, her usual concerns about propriety completely abandoned, agreed with an enthusiasm that shocked even her increasingly callous family members. The remaining enslaved workers, who had witnessed enough to understand what was happening, made desperate attempts to escape, despite the certainty that they would be caught. Their flight was discovered within hours, and their recapture provided the family with an opportunity to refine their methods and explore new possibilities for preparation and presentation. By December 22nd, the house had become a charnel pit, where the normal rules of civilization had been suspended entirely. The family moved through their daily routines with the focused intensity of people engaged in important work, preparing meals with an attention to detail that bordered on the artistic. But it was Silas himself who made the final, most crucial decision that would seal their fate permanently. Looking at his remaining children with the calculating gaze of a man who had spent his life making difficult choices, he concluded that their current situation was unsustainable and that a more permanent solution would be required. The table was set for a family dinner that would be their last. From the shadows of the doorway, Obadiah watched the final meal unfold with the detached interest of a man observing the conclusion of an experiment he had designed years before. The dining room had been restored to its former grandeur for this last occasion. Crystal goblets reflecting candlelight, silver service gleaming against white linen, every detail arranged with the obsessive care of people who understood that appearances mattered even when the world was ending. Silas Croft carved the meat with the same methodical precision he had once applied to dividing his cotton profits. His movements practiced and efficient, despite the tremor in his hands that spoke of a mind finally beginning to crack under the weight of what he had become. His children ate with the focused intensity of wild animals, their earlier pretense of civilized behavior abandoned entirely in favor of the pure satisfaction of appetite finally being met. But as Obadiah studied their faces in the flickering light, he realized something that would have surprised anyone who believed this story was about supernatural vengeance or otherworldly justice. The curse had not made them into monsters. The curse had simply removed their ability to pretend they were anything else. The hunger that consumed them was the same hunger that had always defined the Croft family, the insatiable need to devour everything around them in service of their own desires. They had spent generations feeding on human lives, consuming the labor and dignity and hope of everyone they enslaved, growing fat on suffering they had convinced themselves was natural and right and necessary. What Obadiah had done was not create some supernatural compulsion that forced them to become cannibals. What he had done was far more elegant and far more terrible. He had simply stripped away their capacity for self-deception, removed the elaborate mental structures that allowed them to see their victims as less than human, and forced them to confront the literal truth of what they had always been. Jeremiah's testimony to the Freedmen's Bureau makes this clear in language that cuts through euphemism with the precision of a well-sharpened blade. The curse didn't put the hunger in them, he explained to the bewildered agent, who struggled to make sense of his account. It just opened the door and let it out. They had always been eaters of men, he said. The working just made them honest about it. The genius of Obadiah's revenge was not that it punished the Croft family for their sins, but that it revealed those sins in their purest form. The plantation system had always been cannibalistic, had always been about consuming human beings to feed the appetites of those with power. The only thing that changed was the removal of metaphor, the collapse of the elaborate justifications that allowed such consumption to seem civilized and moral and necessary. In forcing them to literally devour each other, Obadiah had created a perfect mirror of what they had been doing all along, a grotesque reflection that made visible the truth they had spent their lives hiding from themselves and others. Their self-destruction was not the result of some external force compelling them to act against their nature, but the inevitable conclusion of a nature that had always been destructive, always been hungry, always been willing to consume anything and anyone to satisfy its own needs. The final irony was that even as they ate their last meal together, the Croft family probably still believed they were the victims of some inexplicable tragedy rather than the architects of their own perfectly logical doom. They had built a system designed to convert human lives into personal comfort, and when that system finally turned its attention to them, they were as helpless against it as any of their slaves had ever been. As Silas finally looked up from his plate and met Obadiah's eyes across the dining room, there was a moment of recognition that passed between them, an understanding that transcended race and class, and the artificial divisions that had structured their entire world. In that moment, the master finally saw what the slave had always known, that the violence they had fed on for so long had always been destined to consume them in the end. The curse was a mirror, and the Crofts were finally forced to see the devouring beasts they had always been. The silence that descended upon Red Earth Plantation on the morning of December 24th was different from any quiet that had ever settled over that blood-soaked land. It was not the peaceful stillness of snow-muffling sound, nor the expectant hush that comes before a storm, but the profound absence that follows when something that has been making noise for a very long time suddenly stops. Obadiah entered the main house through the kitchen door, his footsteps echoing in corridors that had been filled with whispered conversations and muffled screams for months. The floorboards creaked under his weight with sounds that seemed unnaturally loud in the emptiness, as if the house itself was surprised to discover it was still capable of making normal, innocent noises. The dining room, when he finally reached it, looked exactly as he had expected it would. The mahogany table still bore the remnants of the final feast, bone-white china stained with evidence of appetites finally satisfied, crystal glasses holding the dregs of wine that had gone sour days before. The chairs were overturned, suggesting a struggle or perhaps simply the collapse of people too exhausted by their own consumption to maintain even the pretense of civilized posture. But it was the completeness of the scene that struck him most powerfully. There were no bodies to dispose of, no evidence that would require explanation or burial. The Croft family had accomplished what they had always been destined to accomplish. They had consumed themselves so thoroughly that nothing remained but empty plates and the lingering smell of a meal that should never have been served. Obadiah walked slowly around the table, observing the details with the same careful attention he had once paid to cotton plants, looking for signs of disease or pest damage. The silver carving set lay where Silas had dropped it, its blade still bearing traces of the final cuts he had made. A lace napkin, probably Prudence's, was crumpled beside an overturned water glass, the delicate fabric stained with something that might have been gravy, or might have been something else entirely. He touched nothing, disturbed nothing, left no fingerprints on surfaces that would soon be examined by men who would struggle to make sense of what they found. His presence in that room was not that of a perpetrator returning to the scene of his crime, but of an artist contemplating a work that had finally reached its completion. The house around him told the story of a family's final days through details that spoke louder than any testimony could have. Kitchen knives lay scattered on cutting boards, their edges dulled by use that went far beyond normal food preparation. Pots and pans bore the residue of cooking that had grown increasingly experimental as conventional ingredients became scarce. The wine cellar had been emptied entirely, as if the family had needed vast quantities of alcohol to dull their awareness of what they were doing to each other and themselves. When he was satisfied with his survey, Obadiah simply walked out of the house, the same way he had entered, through the kitchen door that opened onto the path leading to the quarters he would never see again. He carried nothing with him, took no souvenirs or mementos of his years of bondage, left no trace of his presence in the house, where his family's murderers had finally received the justice that mortal law would never have provided. 3 weeks later, a neighbor who had grown concerned about the lack of communication from Red Earth rode over to check on the family's welfare. What he found in that dining room sent him fleeing back to town, with a story so disturbing that the sheriff who recorded it could barely bring himself to write down the details. The official investigation lasted exactly 1 day. The coroner took one look at the scene and declared it beyond his capacity to analyze or explain. The sheriff noted the evidence of what appeared to be a murder, followed by consumption of the victims. But the complete absence of bodies and the isolation of the plantation made any meaningful investigation impossible. The case was closed with a notation that suggested the family had died of fever, though anyone who read the file carefully would notice that this explanation was written in different handwriting than the rest of the report, as if someone had decided after the fact that the truth was too disturbing to preserve in official records. The record was closed, but the truth was walking away on a road west. The man who walked down the dusty road leading away from Red Earth Plantation on Christmas morning of 1859 carried with him only the clothes on his back and something that had not existed in him when he first arrived at that cursed place. It was not vengeance satisfied, for vengeance suggests a settling of accounts that leaves both parties diminished. What Obadiah carried was something closer to completion, the quiet satisfaction of a farmer who had planted seeds in ground he knew would bear exactly the harvest he intended. The simple coat he wore had belonged to another enslaved man who had fled the plantation weeks earlier, abandoning it in his haste to escape. It was rough wool, patched and mended, but to Obadiah it might as well have been the finest silk, because it was the first piece of clothing he had ever worn that belonged to him by right rather than by the sufferance of a master. Behind him, the White House grew smaller with each step, its Greek revival columns already beginning to show signs of the neglect that would eventually reclaim them entirely. The red earth seemed to exhale in his wake, as if the land itself was finally able to breathe freely after years of being compressed under the weight of systematic cruelty. He walked without looking back, not out of dramatic closure, but simply because there was nothing behind him that required his attention anymore. The curse would remain in that soil long after every trace of the Croft family had been consumed, but it would no longer be his burden to carry. He left the hungry land and its full stomach behind him, a ghost story waiting to be told. Today, if you drive the back roads of what was once Blackwater County, you might find yourself on a stretch of cracked asphalt that winds through pine barrens still dark with tannin-stained water. What remains of the main house stands like a broken tooth against the sky, its Greek revival columns wrapped in kudzu vines that have spent more than a century slowly pulling the structure back into the earth. But it is the soil itself that tells the most enduring part of this story. The red earth that gave the plantation its name remains unnaturally vivid. A color so deep and rich that it seems almost wet even during the driest summers. Local farmers will tell you that nothing useful grows in that particular stretch of ground, that crops planted there wither and die despite soil tests showing perfect conditions for agriculture. The South Field, where Obadiah buried his cursed totem more than a century and a half ago, is still barren. Geologists have studied the area, but their reports invariably conclude that there is no scientific reason why the ground should be so completely hostile to plant life. The earth simply refuses to nurture anything that might grow there, as if it has developed a permanent appetite that consumes seeds before they can take root. On certain nights, when the wind moves through the pine barrens in just the right way, local residents claim they can still hear sounds drifting from the direction of the ruined plantation house. Not screams or moans, but something far more unsettling, the sound of chewing, the wet, methodical noise of a family at dinner taking their time with a meal they have been anticipating for far too long. In the community that grew up around the ruins, the story has been preserved with the kind of careful attention that important truths demand. They speak of Obadiah not as a historical figure, but as a reminder, a man who understood that justice sometimes requires patience that spans generations. Subscribe if you found this story compelling, because the archives of the American South contain dozens of similar mysteries. Plantation families who vanished without explanation, places where the earth itself seems to remember violence in ways that defy rational explanation. Some hungers are so profound they become a permanent part of the land.